In 3, in 2, in 1. Hello everybody, it's Timothy here. Thanks for sticking with me and watching my reviews of Aether Revolt. I hope they've been of some help to you. They've definitely been of a little bit of help to me. I managed to 4-0 my very first draft playing white-green, which just turned out to be very, very strong. I think green is definitely just as prevalent and just as powerful in Aether Revolt draft as it was in Triple Kaladesh, and I think white is very borderline close to it. And that goes for the color overall. While I think black has some really strong uncommons, I think the commons are generally weak, whereas white, we'll see, has a lot of really playable, just solid cards. So moving into the review, as always with the videos, start off with the rating scale here. By this point, if you've been watching, you kind of know how I rate the cards. I should say this is all based on my personal opinion and based off of, at this point, just a few drafts and pre-release events, so I don't have a full understanding of the format, but pretty good idea of where I think these cards lie. Moving right in, I can proudly say, as I did with almost every other color, sorry black, that there aren't really any unplayable cards in white. There are some that are really skirting the edge of unplayable that we'll see here, but at least they have synergies in certain type of decks. There are no dubious challenges in white this time around, something you just absolutely should not and cannot ever put in your deck. With that being said, we do have a couple cards that I do think should stay in your sideboard. When Consulate Crackdown was released, I heard a lot of buzz about it, obviously for constructed reasons and Commander. But for Limited, a lot of people debate on whether or not this is a good main deck card. My inclination, like I said with a lot of the other cards with this similar effect, is you should keep this in your sideboard. And the reason I say that is, yes, Aether Revolt is an artifact-heavy set, and Kaladesh has its artifact themes going for it as well. But I've seen plenty of decks at pre-release that just don't run that many artifacts, which makes this a very good sideboard card, and usually a very good main deck card, but sometimes it'll just be a dead card, and I think for that reason, you shouldn't punish yourself with a dead card and should leave it in the sideboard. With that being said, in the matchups where you actually want to play Consulate Crackdown, it goes up to an easy 8 or 9. It's just going to completely devastate your opponent's board. And I'll mention this again with one of our later cards, but enchantments are a lot harder to remove this time around. Decommission, I believe, I might be wrong about this, but Decommission is the only naturalized effect that actually deals with enchantments in Aether Revolt. All the other ones only hit artifacts. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. And of course, I'm not including cards like Appetite for the Unnatural, which Kaladesh still has. Decommission obviously belongs here as well. This is pretty much a glorified Appetite for the Unnatural that takes a little bit of work. It is nice that it's Revolt on an instant, which means it's a little bit easier to set up. But the timing might be weird. Like, you might have to block with a creature, let it die, and then cast this. But it will work most of the time, and at the very least, you could still play it as 3 mana, destroy an artifact or enchantment, just a disenchant effect if the Revolt isn't on, and it'll still be fine. But it's not powerful enough that I think you need to main deck it. I think if you are main decking it, you're more worried about enchantments than you are artifacts, because there are better ways to deal with artifacts than a 3 mana spell. But the enchantment part is pretty important in this set, because the enchantments kind of get away with murder in this set when opponents aren't able to remove them very easily. Alright, let's look at some weak cards first. The first is Peace Walker Colossus. I saw this card come up a good bit during pre-release, and it looks like a very powerful card, but if you're being completely fair, if you're being completely unbiased, it's actually really, really weak unless you're in a specific artifact, or I'm sorry, vehicle build. Now, on its own, 3 mana, 6/6 Crew 4 is just not impressing me. Crew 4 is very, very expensive, even on a 3 mana artifact, and you're just getting a big beater. There is basically the same card at common for 4 mana instead of 3, and I believe the crew cost on that one is cheaper. I might be wrong about it. I'm talking about the Iron Tread Crusher, whatever its name is. This card's not really that far off, and that one's a common. When you do start crewing this, it's worse than things like Ardar Express. It's just a 6/6. It doesn't do anything special. So the real power is in its activated ability, which is fantastic if you're in a very heavy vehicle deck. But you need to have multiple vehicles before that becomes an actual real threat. If you're just playing this and one other vehicle, so what, right? You're not going to draw them together often enough that you'll be able to combo with them. And if you're just attacking with this as a 6/6, there are better vehicles at much lower rarities to do that job. So I'm thinking Peace Walker Colossus is kind of a build around rare. One that you take early and then you start prioritizing really strong, cheap vehicles. But on its own, I think it's a pretty poor card, and I wouldn't play it otherwise. Same goes for the implement here. This is just the most god-awful implement. The black one's fine. The red one, somehow I like this one less than the red one. I think gaining 2 life is less important than dealing 1 damage, apparently. But the reason the white one gets a 2 instead of a 0 is because white is actually really heavy in Revolt, and you need to have ways to trigger it pretty consistently. Now, it's a 2. It's narrow because there are better ways of triggering Revolt than using a really crappy card like this. But if you can't find anything else and you really have the payoffs for Revolt, I could see running at least 1 implement, but I wouldn't go crazy. This is not a good card. Do not run it unless you absolutely have to, and please pray that you don't have to. The 3s here, these are weak cards in my opinion, and this is where my naivete in the format really shines, because I don't know how a lot of these cards are actually going to play out. I know I've been killed by aerial modification once, so maybe that makes it a fine card, but it seems really expensive, and if you're not putting it on a vehicle, it's not super impressive. Now, this could easily be a 4 or 5 in my opinion, because it is kind of a late game card that can push through a lot of damage if you're in an aggressive deck, but as is, I think it's a little overcosted for the type of effect you're getting, even though it has some really neat combo potential with some of the vehicles in this set. And just like the red siege, or I'm sorry, the red modification, I believe it's called siege modification, it can just win games out of nowhere, as evidenced by one of the games I lost during pre-release weekend. They just slapped this on a pretty mediocre vehicle and I just died within 2 turns. That will happen from time to time, which makes me kind of give a nod to this, but it's a very reluctant nod. Death Dismissal is a card that surprises me because it looks terrible and I'm pretty sure it plays out terrible. If it kills a creature, that's fine, but then it just did the same thing Impeccable Timing did, and that's a common and not even like an amazing one. I do like Impeccable Timing, but I don't think Death Dismissal is really that much better. Obviously, you can split the damage up, but it has to be between attacking or blocking creatures, and it has to be pretty low toughness creatures for this to really matter, and it's just overcosted. If this costs 3, it would be a good bit better. If it costs 2, it would be actually really, really good. But at 4 mana, I don't even like this card. I don't think it's that great. So I don't, maybe it has some value here, but I think white can do better than a very situational 3 damage. Even dividing it up, I don't think is worth the extra mana you're paying here. Alley Evasion is a card that I've heard a lot of people say they like, and I like it too. I just don't think it's very strong. I do think it's a very replaceable card. Similar with the Implement, this is a card that's very useful for triggering Revolt or making sure Revolt is active by returning a creature you control to your hand, but I think there are better ways to do that, or at least more efficient ways. This also lets you rebuy into the battlefield triggers, which isn't irrelevant. That could be useful in a lot of decks. And I just think the power and toughness boost here isn't that significant. It is good enough that it'll help you save a creature, but not good enough that it'll always let you trade 1 for 1 on a removal spell. Or not a removal spell, but in a combat or something like that. If I'm using it for the first mode, I'd rather have Built to Smash, and if I'm using it for the second mode, I think there are much better cards to do that. Obviously, the strength of the card comes in the flexibility of having both, but I don't think either mode is particularly strong. And then we have Aegis Automaton, which is just a much worse, much more inefficient version of the second mode here. This is just an engine card, but it's such a late game engine card and such a really pitiful early game card that I don't like it overall. I think you can play this and you will play at least one of these, probably never more than one if you're in some sort of like combo into the battlefield trigger deck, or you just need to have Revolt going. I do think it's better than the Implement in that regards, but I still don't think at that activation cost this is a very good card. And honestly, I would cut it or at least look to get better Revolt enablers before I start playing this card. Compared to something like Acrobatic Maneuver, this just isn't even a contest. I think I would always give the nod to something like Acrobatic Maneuver for doing the same kind of thing that I want to do here than I would for Aegis Automaton. Alright, the 4s, archetypal cards here. Now, Call for Unity is one that really confuses me, or at least in regards to how powerful it's going to play out. I have played with this card once. It was fine. It just wasn't very crazy, and I was in a pretty dedicated Revolt deck, one that could trigger Revolt pretty consistently. The problem was, I still found it hard to get this going turn after turn on my turn. The same thing I said for the green card that's very similar. I believe it's called Help from the Cow or something like that. This is very similar. I do think the upside on this card is much more powerful because it's in white, and white wants to have these sort of Anthem effects. And if you ever really get this going up to 2+ counters, it's probably enough to help you win the game on its own. So it is a very powerful effect, but it is a build around, right? You need to have Revolt consistently, which is where cards like Conviction come in, which is where cards like the Implement come in, so on and so forth. Just relying on your creatures dying in combat or being picked off by removal spells isn't enough for me to justify playing this card. It's the type of card I would be happy picking up pretty early, maybe pack 1, pick 1, and then really trying to dedicate myself to a Revolt deck, because the payoff is there. It just takes a little bit of work to get it going. Conviction is a card that I think is fine. I think +1/+3 is a pretty aggressively costed card where it lets you just kind of swing in with your creatures. There are a lot of 1 toughness creatures that are still aggressively costed, 3/1s, 3/2s, things like that. And this lets you push those creatures in the early game, and you can return Conviction to your hand, which A, helps you enable Revolt, or B, lets you put it on a different creature to start attacking with that one. So I do like Conviction. I just don't think it's an overall powerful card. It goes up way in value if you're trying to trigger Revolt, because it's a very cheap way to trigger Revolt whenever you want. It's not the best way to do it, but it is very cheap. You slap this on an early creature, and as long as you have 1 white mana floating around, you have a way to trigger Revolt whenever you need it. So I do like Conviction as a card. I just think it won't make the cut a good number of times. Alright, and then we start getting into filler. These are cards that I think I'm happy to play. I'm not going to be super disappointed, but they're cards that I'm willing to pass pretty early and go for something better. These are not the type of cards I see and I'm wowed and I'm like, oh, white's open or anything like that. They're just solid, decent white cards. The most notable ones on the bottom here are just kind of vanilla creatures. A 3/2 for 3 is like filler by definition. It's probably even a little bit worse in this format with things like Shock floating around. And Audacious Infiltrator is just a card, right? It's an aggressively costed 3/1. There's nothing wrong with that in white, since white wants to be attacking. We saw this same exact card in Battle for Zendikar, if you remember. I do not remember the name of the card, but it had the same effect where it couldn't be blocked by Eldrazi Scion, and this one can't be blocked by artifact creatures, which are both relevant to their individual sets. That card was good, so I'm fine playing one of these, but I'm not going to load up on them unless I'm super aggro. 1 toughness is a huge liability in this format, though, which is also why Aeronaut Admiral is kind of getting a little bit of a thumbs down for me. This is a fine card. A 3-power flyer at 4 mana is okay. I like it a good bit. I do think the vehicles having flying thing is not super relevant. I think there are better ways to kind of make a vehicle deck than having this, but it's a nice little bonus that'll come up from time to time. I just think the 1 toughness here is selling itself a little bit short. If this was a 3/2, I think it would be an easy 6, but at a 3/1, I think it dies to enough things, including Thopter tokens, that I have to consider it a filler card. Not to mention, I opened a couple of these and just cut them from my white decks because they were better 4-drops to play. Speaking of 4-drops, Aether Inspector, I think, is one of the worst of this entire Aether cycle. I think it is actually the worst. For some reason, we're paying 4 mana for a 2/3, and I don't think Vigilance is worth the extra mana here. Again, demonstrating the difference between a single mana. If this was 3, this would be a perfectly fine card. A 3 mana 2/3 with Vigilance would be good, and the effect tacked on would be fine. But I don't think the combination of effects here justifies this being a 4-drop, and I think it's enough worse than the rest of the cycle, and sometimes just won't be able to attack by the time you play this, since it doesn't really have the body to hold up in combat by that time. It's a fine card. You could play one of these, but it's the first on my chop and block if I have to start making cuts. And then Countless Gears Renegade has upside, but it's not so significant of upside that you need to be drafting 1,000 of these. You are getting a servo out of it if you can trigger Revolt, but that's not going to happen a lot by turn 2. And if you're playing this after turn 2, it's losing a lot of the value you get off that servo. This is a nice little go wide card, same as Aether Inspector, and I do like go wide strategies in white since there's a lot of kind of Anthem effects and board pumps and stuff like that in both sets here. So I think this is a fine card. I just don't think it's amazing by any means. Alright, moving past filler, we're starting to see cards I'm excited about. It's really, really weird. I kind of waffled back and forth on this one. It's weird that Ghirapur Osprey, in my mind, is a 6, whereas some of the other cards we just saw are 5s. But I don't know. There was something about the way this played out during my pre-releases and during my first draft that I just like the card. It's just Windrake, and Windrake was bad. Windrake just sucked in Limited. And this is exactly Windrake, but it's in a color where Windrake is more relevant. You want to be attacking, and this thing just got in there early enough and often enough that I was pretty happy playing multiple copies of it. This type of card is usually pretty good, but it just goes to show it's just better in certain colors. So I do think this is a pretty good card. I would play multiples of them, and it would not be my first consideration for cuts. I would be happy playing a lot of these. Restoration Specialist, not a card I've had any experience playing with or against yet, but it's pretty surprising that it's a 2-mana 2/1 and also has a very relevant late game effect. This getting back an artifact from your graveyard is great, and white has some pretty decent enchantments that might end up in the graveyard, including auras, so I think the ability to get back an artifact and an enchantment is really, really nice. Most of the time you'll sack this to get an artifact back, and that's not the best way to use a creature, but I do think it gives the card a little bit of extra value since it is just a bear here. This has the potential to be a 2-for-1 that can also deal damage in the early game, so I like it quite a bit. The 7s. Alright, we're starting to get into the meat of white here, and white has a lot of very good cards, starting with Felidar Guardian. Remember, we're talking about limited, not constructed, so we're not going to go there. If you open Saheeli, well, there you go. Have fun. Felidar Guardian, I think, is just a good card. Being able to rebuy enter the battlefield triggers and also activate a revolt effect off of a creature without really having to work for it is pretty nice. By that I mean, of course, you can target something with revolt with Felidar Guardian's ability. It blinks out, comes back in, same way it would with acrobatic maneuver, and the revolt condition is satisfied. A 1/4 is not the most impressive in this set for 4 mana, so this is not a card that's going to hold up very nicely against super aggressive decks or heavy vehicle decks, but I think it gives you enough value that you could justify playing multiple copies. Not to mention they go infinite with each other, so keep that in mind. Ninth Bridge Patrol is sometimes an infinite power attacker. SRAM is a card that's a little bit hard to evaluate because the ability is not going to come up that often, but when it does come up, it'll be very good. It is also just a 2-mana 2/2. This is not a card you're ever excited to open. This is not an 8 or anything higher than that. Not a bomb by any means, but just an efficient little card that kind of gives direction to what you're drafting. It does encourage you to draft vehicles very highly. I don't think there are any equipment in Aether Revolt. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But there's a couple pieces that you could play from Kaladesh. And then obviously there are some pretty decent auras in white that you could be playing. The flyers here, they're both 5-mana flyers. I think they're both excellent cards. Airdrop Arnuts is basically a flying Arborback Stomper, which is saying quite a bit. If you have to run this out on turn 5, you've got a very efficient flyer. I've mentioned this a bunch of times, but a 3/3 flyer for 5 is kind of my baseline for flyers, and any point of power or toughness higher than that just makes it a better card. The fact that you can sometimes tack 5 life onto this guy coming into the battlefield is just absurd, and this card can really stabilize a game while also pushing you far, far ahead and keeping you ahead if you're in an already winning position. Dawnfeather Eagle impressed me quite a bit. This is a very strong common. Having multiples is good. This is one of the payoffs for being very all-in on a go-wide strategy. You know, your quote-unquote inspired charge decks. Really love playing cards like this. And the fact that it gives Vigilance on top of the Anthem effect, I found played out very nicely, while also giving you just a sizable threat in the air. It trades off nicely with the other 5 and 6 drop flyers in this set, and I think it's a very solid card. So I could play multiple of these and be very happy with them. Harpooner, not a card that I've seen come up yet, but it seems like it has an ability that's just pretty strong. At 3 mana, this is the type of card that you have to jump through a couple hoops to get working, and not to mention it only destroys a tapped creature, but this is the type of card that also works very nicely with instant speed blink effects like acrobatic maneuvers or whatever it is, the stratagem, I don't know, the blue card, 4 mana blue card. If you can do this at instant speed on your opponent's turn, you can actually kill an attacker with it, which is pretty sweet. You do usually have to take a hit off something before Deadeye Harpooner has the ability to kill it, and you also have to make sure you have Revolt on that turn. This is the type of card I was talking about. You might have to play something like Conviction or the White Implement if you really want to consistently pull this ability off. But I think the card is fine. The fail side of this is that it's a 3 mana 2/2, which is not impressing anybody, but still trades for a creature. There are a lot of 3 mana 3/2s in this set, so if you can ever get the ability off, it's a definite 8. If you can't, you have the potential to hold it back. You don't have to run it out there. Caught in the Brights is fine. I think it's a little bit worse than Revoke Privileges, since every time I played it, I noticed they were just crew and vehicles. It does go up a tiny little bit in value if you have 1 or 2 vehicles, since you can then get it in your graveyard. Triggers Revolt for the turn, exiles a creature, does a lot of really neat things, but at 3 mana Pacifism, I'm already sold on the card, but I would pick it pretty highly, but there's a card that I think just jumps in front of it, which we'll see in a second. And then finally, another 3/1 here, quite a few of those. Aether Geode Miner is a really wonky kind of effect. It's kind of like a trick attacker. Your opponent pretty much has to block it, and you then have the option of trading off or blanking it. So you get to kind of like do this feint attack where you get to bluff whether or not you're trying to deal damage or whether or not you're trying to trigger Revolt for the turn. A lot of times your opponent just snap blocks and you have to use the energy right away. And that's fine, because a lot of times when you attack with this and you realize that's the situation, you probably have something to follow up with Revolt. This is a nice way to enable Revolt without actually using any mana, and it's a pretty aggressive creature. Not to mention, if you don't have to blink this, you're just getting 2 energy every time it attacks, which is pretty nice because there's some really neat energy sinks you can use that for in this set, even though white is not the best color for using energy. All right, 8s. These are, in my mind, very... I'm very firm on these being 8s here. Strong first pick material. Not absolute bombs. Not going to win you the game on their own, but solid enough that you'll pick them almost every time, and they're very few cards that you would pick over them. Stram's Expertise, I played with it twice in 2 separate settings. It's just very impressive. even if you don't get to cast a card for free, 4 mana for 3 servos is perfectly fine, in my opinion, since white has cards like Dawnfeather Eagle and Call for Unity, and these effects that really benefit you for putting a bunch of tokens or a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, and then you just get to cast something for free, which is nice. A lot of times I played this just for value. I got 3 servos and an Osprey, which is a lot for 4 mana, so this is a very, very good card. Not quite bomb status, I don't think. It's not so impressive that it's just going to win you the game on its own, but it is very nice, and just a lot of value for 4 mana. Thopter Arrest is an O-Stone type effect. It kits artifacts or creatures, and like I said with Consulate Crackdown, it's kind of hard to get rid of enchantments in this set. There are a few things that bounce permanents, or there are a few things, very few things, that destroy enchantments, but there aren't a lot of ways to get rid of this once it hits the battlefield, and it'll work as hard removal a vast majority of the time. And then Solemn Recruit, this is the type of card I love opening. I haven't played with it yet, but I hope I can during the duration of this format. 2/2 Double Striker for 3 is already a good card. Revolt makes this an absolute powerhouse. Get 1 counter on this, you have a ridiculous card on your hands. Get more than that, you have a game-winning card on your hands. Not to mention, this is the type of card that benefits you for trading on turn 2. Or trading your 2 drops off and then just slamming this and punishing your opponent for taking the trade. I like this card quite a bit. I think it is very, very close to a bomb, but since it needs work to get going, it has a little bit of work to make it a bomb. So I think 8 is a good place for it. And then our final card in white, this is a tricky one to evaluate. It really is. I opened this in a pre-release, but ended up not playing it. I had a blue-white flyer deck put together, but it turned out my aggressive deck was good enough that I didn't have to play that deck, so I didn't get to experience the Exquisite Archangel. Now, this has the type of effect. I mentioned this in the spoiler videos when I was reviewing the cards. This has the type of effect that just goes, oh, wow, cool. But when you really evaluate it, I don't actually think it's that amazing. You have to be losing the game for this effect to be relevant at all, which makes it a nice little bonus. If you're ahead, then you're ahead, right? A 5/5 flyer for 7 is just going to kill your opponent. But if you're so far behind and you slam this, you know, and you get the ability, you might eat a creature, it might stop you from dying, but you're still behind. You need to stop deck something else. You need to play something else. So I don't think that ability is super amazing. I do think this is still a bomb, not just because of the ability, but because it's tacked onto such an efficient, super powerful flyer. If this was like, if this had any other stats or didn't have flying, it would just be like, I wouldn't be impressed by it. And I don't think it's a 10. I really don't. It might not even be a 9 in my opinion, but I decided to give white its just desserts here and bump one of their cards up to 9. With that being said, I already mentioned this for black, but Herald of Anguish definitely deserves to be a 10. If I'm comparing it to a card like this, it's no contest in my mind. Herald of Anguish is a solid 10. I give it a 9, but it should be a 10. This is probably closer to an 8 in my actual mind, like how I'm willing to evaluate it. But I figured it has a unique enough effect and a powerful enough body that it could be considered just a bomb, even if I don't think it's an absolute game-winning bomb every single time. Fun story about this. I watched a person play this in pre-release, and on the other side of the board was a 4/4 double striking scrap champion. He took first strike damage off the scrap champion, triggered this ability, went back up to 20, and then took double strike damage off the scrap champion. So the angel really didn't do its job there. I guess it stopped him from dying, but he still miserably lost that game. Fun little story there. But yeah, 10, sorry. White usually has 10. White usually has ridiculous bombs, but unfortunately I'm not seeing any in Aether Revolt. I'd be really interested to hear if you guys think there are any 10s. Maybe I valued something a little bit lower than I should, but that's for you guys to let me know and me to evaluate later. So anyway, with that being said, the last couple things to look at here, I'm going to look at all of the artifacts together, probably leaving off the artifacts with colored activated abilities, since I've looked at them in their individual colors. But I will be looking at the majority of the artifacts, and there are quite a few in this set, so that'll be a long video. And then I will talk about the multicolored cards in a separate video, and that one won't be as long since there aren't as many. But as always, thank you all for watching. I hope this is helpful for you. I'd love to know if it was helpful, so if it was, if you found this to be useful in any way, shape, or form, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'd love to have a conversation about how your pre-releases went or what you're thinking about draft. So that being said, my name's Timothy. Stay tuned for the next video coming up soon, and I will see y'all next time.